the drafting of our report. One very important thing we're looking forward to in this discussion is your input on, but perhaps the best way to do this is to present you first. So Matt, for everybody's sake, is a professor at Harvard Kennedy School. We have great ambitions for the Kennedy School and Morocco, going beyond this, but hopefully this will be the first step in the many things we are exploring and we'd like to do together. Matt is the founding faculty director of the Building State Capability Program, which is a program in itself and is very much what we're looking forward to hear about today. He works with governments across the world and is helping them implement complex policies successfully. He has developed a process called, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, problem-driven iterative adaptation, PDIA. Yes. We have lots of acronyms in this commission. We'll add this one with pleasure. You will describe your approach and also discuss potential application in Morocco, using also stories of its impact in other countries. Before we start, and you will see Matt will speak for about 30-40 minutes, and then my colleagues will ask questions. I have 3 burning questions, which you may want to keep in mind as we go through this. How do you set priorities? How do you unblock blockages? And how do you measure success? These are things we've been constantly benchmarking ourselves and our work against, and I want to make sure that we do address this. I know you've worked in a number of countries, which experience might be relevant to this one. But before we start, I want to use a quote from your book, which I thought very interesting. You or someone has attributed it to Albert Einstein, one of our greatest heroes. I'm not sure it sounds like Albert Einstein, but I will still say it for the benefit of everybody. Theory is when you know everything and nothing works. Practice is when everything works and nobody knows why. We have put together theory and practice, meaning nothing is working and nobody knows why. So there you go.
That's a very good one.
Fouad, I'm sure you didn't have that one.
Yeah. Well, Michael, thank you for inviting me. It's really great to be here. I emailed Michael earlier and I explained that I would rather not use a PowerPoint. I went back and forward with this, and I was talking with Fouad just before we began, and I explained that, in a lot of the teaching that I do now online, I find that the PowerPoint really gets between me and the people I want to talk to. You're looking at a PowerPoint instead of looking at me. And one of the things that Michael had asked is that we could have a robust time of question and answer. And my sense is, if you want to have a good time of question and answer, you need to be able to have some rapport with the person who you are asking the questions of. So I thought it would be better if you spent the time looking at me and not looking at a PowerPoint. I hope that is okay. I do understand that you often have PowerPoints. I don't want you to feel for a second that I have not prepared for the presentation. I just haven't done a PowerPoint. It's really great to be in this group. I have worked in countries across the world, and countries that are struggling to deal with a variety of issues. Many of these issues have to do with the challenge of growth, the challenge of development. Sometimes it's about providing jobs for people. Sometimes it's about expanding access to healthcare. Sometimes it's about moving beyond just schooling and actually ensuring that people are learning. My understanding is that many of those issues are issues in Morocco, and that you are in a country that has experienced significant success, but that success has come also with significant limits. And so the question then is, what do we do about it? Now, you could also have attributed or you could have referenced the other statement that I think we attribute to Albert Einstein in the book, Michael, which is about the definition of insanity, right? Is doing the same thing again and again when it doesn't work, or something to that effect. And one of the reasons why we have come up with our own approach, PDIA, our own acronym, is not because the world needs more of them, but because we think that governments need to think differently about how they address the challenge of development, and about how they address the challenge of implementation, and about how they think about their capability. And so it's not meant to be an acronym for acronym's sake. It's meant to be a different way of thinking, a different way of doing. And I think that might be interesting for you here today. Now, I'm going to spend about 30 or 40 minutes, and the key message that I want to put out there is something I have on this board behind me. Fuad told me he can read it quite clearly, but I will go through it very for the people who can't. What we see most governments when they develop a vision, like you guys are trying to do, when they develop a strategy, when they develop a plan, is that they are putting together long lists of projects, long lists of things that need to be done. And the theory is that if you implement these discrete projects, you will get development. If you manage to implement all the things you identify that need to be done to create jobs, all the things that need to be done to improve healthcare, all the things that need to be done to empower women, whatever it may be, you will get development. Now, what we have found is that this thinking is quite limited. We have found that many governments can't implement their discrete projects, and they come to me to say, please help us, because we don't know how to do this. And so the first thing is that the projects that you have are often not implementable. The second thing that we find is that some countries get past that and they say, well, how do we implement the discrete projects? And they outsource the implementation to consulting firms or whoever that may be, and they manage to do it. But what they find is that the projects don't get them where they want to go to, and that it costs them so much to do the implementation that afterwards they can't afford to do anything new. So what we have found when we look around the world and we see which countries actually have successful vision statements that lead to development, they don't follow this implement discrete projects and develop mindset or logic. Rather, they build systemic capability through the projects that they identify. They build systemic capability through the projects that they identify. And that the vision becomes about building capability, not about delivering projects or products. Okay? So let me go through that again, because this is very important. Most vision statements or plans or strategies list projects and list deliverables and list products and say, this is what we're going to do. And the idea is if we implement them, we develop them. Most of them fail because they either can't implement them, or they implement them once and they find that they don't actually get where they want to.
Michael, can I interrupt you? Before the session, I could indeed see the board, the whiteboard, but now we cannot actually see it. We see only half of it.
Oh, okay.
Buy some glasses for
I can see it fine. Maybe yes, I turn myself off.
Yes, that's much better. Yes, exactly.
Is that better?
That was exactly what I was able to see before we started.
Okay, you see me now completely.
We see you and we see the board.
Okay, I'm sorry that you only get to see me and not Michael as well. I think it's a much inferior picture, but hopefully you see the board. Okay, so the idea here is that where we see governments that have successfully fostered development, successfully fostered progress, and by the way, there aren't that many of them in the world, we find that they get past this idea of a vision statement or a strategy or a plan involving lots and lots and lots of projects that they want to implement. And instead, what they focus on is building systemic capability. Now, I want to give you one more thought before I move on and we just discuss. that when we define capability, we're thinking about the demonstrated empowered abilities to do things. The demonstrated and empowered abilities to do things. I'd like to separate it from a conversation about capacity. In development, we often speak about capacity, and what we're usually referring to is essentially the training that people get to learn new things. What we find is that many governments and many countries and even many private organizations have much more capacity than they use. Their people have been trained to do much more than they actually do. So capability goes beyond that and asks, how many of the abilities are actually empowered and demonstrated that you can actually do things that you need to do? And we are interested in building capability through projects rather than mustering the capability just to implement projects. Building capability through projects rather than mustering the capability to just implement discrete projects. Now, we're interested also in this at a systemic level. We don't want to just have capability to do one thing at one point in time. We're very interested in building the independent, durable, sustained, and dynamic ability to do things over periods of time. Where in governments and in countries, in private sectors, in public sectors, and in the nonprofit community, you are building these empowered abilities where people can move from challenge to challenge over time and address those challenges effectively without help. That is essentially what the definition of development is. Do you have this capability to do things that you need to do as the definition of those things change? Now, the message here is that this should become the vision. And Michael, when you asked earlier, you said some of the questions of like, how do we set priorities? How do we unblock blockages? How do we measure progress? If I would think about the last one, I would say to you, you measure progress by asking, is our country more capable than it was a year ago? Is our country on the track to become more capable than it is today in 5 years? And how do we measure that capability is the key question. It's not how many projects do we have, how many products do we have, it's how capable are we to move into the future with success. Now, why do we have this message? Because it's a very different message to many development organizations. It's a very different message to even many theorists who would say the way in which you become successful is by learning how to do this discrete thing or this discrete thing or that discrete thing and implementing it properly. We think it's much more about developing the capability to do a lot of things and to be able to do those things in a dynamic way. And the reason why we at the Building State Capability have come to this understanding is because we observe, firstly, that there are very, very few countries that have effectively developed and effectively moved from being low income to lower middle income to upper middle income to higher income countries. There are very few. And the countries that have are countries that have demonstrated capabilities to do different things over different periods of time. Think of Singapore. Singapore is an interesting country. Everyone refers to it. And so I'm not only going to refer to it, but it is an interesting country to think of. People often say, well, Singapore grew because it had a great 5-year plan. And it implemented that 5-year plan according to how the plan worked. And it essentially then had rolling 5-year plans from 1959 onwards. It's not a true story. The true story about Singapore is that the first 5-year plan was hatched out when Singapore was part of the Malaysian Federation. And when they were part of the Malaysian Federation, the theory was that they would grow by providing consumer goods to the Malaysian Federation. But when 1962 and 1963 arrived and they were removed from the Malaysian Federation, that 5-year plan fell apart. So what did they do? Well, they started to say to themselves, we need to build capabilities to find our way in a future that we are unsure of. We don't know what the strategy should be. We don't know how we're going to be successful. So what are we going to do? We're going to professionalize our civil service. We're going to train people to do a variety of things. We're going to invest in infrastructure that will give us a lot of interesting opportunities. And we're going to scour the world to see who would like to come here and what they would like to do. Now, the story of Singapore is that it took them 4 or 5 or 6 years to actually see any success with this. But because they built this base of capability, they managed to move their economy from being essentially based on a very narrow set of products to being based on a very diverse set of products in a short period of time. And one of the things we know about Singapore is that it has been a very dynamic economy. The country has not stayed where it was in the early 1970s when it started to build its economy based on microelectronics. It's moved from chemicals to microelectronics to much more sophisticated forms of economic growth. And part of the reason why it's done that is because it invested in the capability of government and of the private sector to be dynamic. Now, we could say exactly the same story about South Korea. We could also say the same story about countries that have had more defined or more specific forms of growth and but have been equally surprising, like Cape Verde. Cape Verde is an island off the west coast of Africa. And many people don't see Cape Verde because it is so small, but it's one of the success stories of Africa over the last generation. The story of Cape Verde is partly that they said to themselves, how do we grow? How do we become more independent? How do we become more successful? And they said, let us build the capability to be a tourism magnet. And over a period of time, they focused on building the capabilities, which is infrastructure, talent, capital, attracting it, keeping it, building it. And if you look at Cape Verde today, you will see that it totally outperforms many of the countries that are of similar size, many of the countries that are in its region, because it built its capability. The interesting thing that we see is that they built their capability before they had the opportunity. And that's part of the key message here. You don't say, well, let's define what our projects are, and those projects are the things that we implement. You say, let's build the capability through projects that we put in place, and let's let that capability create the opportunities in the future for us. So the key message here is don't get stuck when you are developing a new strategy, when you're developing a vision, when you're developing a plan, in just making a list of projects that you think today will work for you. Because you don't know if they will work for you. You don't know if you can muster the capability to implement them. And what we find is that the discrete projects like that will not help you build systemic capability to find and succeed in the projects of the future. What you really want to be doing is asking yourself, what capabilities do we need to grow now so that we can be ready for that time? So I could tell you stories of Costa Rica, I could tell you stories of Bahrain, countries that essentially have invested in these capabilities and allowed the capabilities to facilitate the emergence of opportunities in the future. But what I want to get to now is the question, well, how do you go about building these capabilities? Because many people say to us, well, that story sounds great. If we could build those capabilities, if we knew how to do them, we would do them. But how do we do that? So in the last 10 years, we have been asking ourselves exactly that question. If governments want to move beyond developing policies that deliver stuff and instead create policies that deliver capability, and then that capability delivers more policies in the future, how do they do it? And this is where we came up with the acronym that Michael introduced earlier called Problem-Driven Iterative Adaptation, PDIA. It is essentially an approach or a process of implementing public policy where the goal is not just to implement a specific discrete project or policy, but the goal is to use the vehicle of the policy or the project to build capabilities that allow you to do more in the future. The idea is that instead of focusing on a solution, you focus on a problem. You say, we have unemployment with our youth right now. We don't really understand how to solve that. Let us bring people together in teams who should be doing this job, people in the civil service, people in the private sector, people in the nonprofit community, who should be doing the job and should be coordinating better than they have in the past. And let's have them identify the problem. Then let's have them break the problem down so that they can identify entry points to start acting. And let them start acting together to solve that problem in ways that they can actually use currently. So we're not asking them to think into the future. We're just asking them to build with the capabilities they have now. What we do then is we iterate very aggressively, meaning we go step by step, and each step is short, 1, 2, 3 weeks. The team goes away and they take a bunch of steps and they try some activities. They come back, they say, what did we do? What did we learn? What are we struggling with? And what's next? And we use that methodology to essentially build their way towards success. Problem-driven, iterative, adaptation. Let me give you some examples. We worked in Sri Lanka, which is one of the stories that we have on our videos. And Ahmed was sharing that with us earlier. And Michael might have shared with you some of the videos that we have. We have some videos that have French subtitles. We worked with a team in Sri Lanka where the government came to us and said, our biggest problem is that we cannot attract foreign direct investment in new sectors. We don't know how to do this. The last time that we did this in Sri Lanka was in the late 1970s, at which time we managed to attract investors in the clothing and textile sector. And they came into that sector. They totally revamped the economy. It was an incredible thing for the country. But we've been kind of living on that for a long period of time now. And so they said, it's not that we haven't tried things. We have lots of projects. We have lots of policies. We have a big organization called the Board of Investment that hires thousands of people. And those people are here to find foreign direct investment. They just haven't been able to do it in new sectors. And now we have a difficulty because the clothing sector is moving progressively from Sri Lanka to Bangladesh. And people in Sri Lanka don't want to work in that sector anymore because the kinds of jobs are not the jobs that they're looking for. So we find ourselves in this place where this kind of cash cow that we've had is moving away and we don't have anything to replace it with. And we don't really have the capital. We don't really have the know-how that we need to be able to invade a new sector. That needs to come from abroad. So we said, well, that's great. Why don't we develop a team and have that team work on this and learn how to do this? Now, at exactly the same time, there was a prominent consulting firm and they were working with the Sri Lankan government and they'd said, no, we don't need to do that. What we need to do is we need to essentially go out and find a cure to your problem. We just need to go find an investor and we will go and do that for you. It's a little bit like the narrative you hear from some countries with regards to the COVID virus, which is everything will go away when we have some kind of vaccine. In waiting for the vaccine, they're basically saying we don't need to do any of the behavioral change or the capacity building. So we left that consulting firm and we said, you guys go and do that thing. That's fine. The capability to do this needs to be in the government. And we put a team together and the team started to ask questions. Well, why don't we have investment? And they started to identify that they didn't know how to identify sectors where there might be some potential in Sri Lanka. They didn't know how to find investors in those sectors. They didn't know how to speak to those investors. They didn't know how to deal with the fact that the country had a whole lot of doing business issues that made it very costly to do business there, and that those things were likely to get in the way of success. They didn't know how they could mobilize other parts of government to work with them in this effort. So we said to them, that's great. Break that problem down into all of those parts. And why don't we start as a team, 5, 6 people, who all should be doing this job because they actually come from the public and the private sector in the country. And let's get you thinking about how to solve those problems. So let's start off saying, which sectors should you move into? And the team said, we don't know. I said, okay, you have 1 day to come up with ideas. There's 6 of you. Come back tomorrow with new ideas. Now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say to them, you have a problem. You have latent capability to identify a solution. We don't know if it'll work or not, but your solution might be as good as any consulting firms. So we're going to put you on the spot and we're going to squeeze you and say, come up with the idea. Lo and behold, the next day, we had 6 ideas. The team came back and they said, well, I called my friend in the World Bank and my friend in the World Bank suggested that these sectors were a good idea. I hadn't thought about that, but that's what I heard. Another person said, well, you know what? I went and I had a look at which investors had knocked on our door in the last few years. And I thought, if they've knocked on our door, maybe they're interested. Maybe it's a good fit. So I've made a list of what those sectors are. One of the team members came back and she said, I went and spoke to my dad. We said, well, that's a really strange strategy. What did your dad say? He said, well, my dad said that in China, there are solar panel manufacturers. And the solar panel manufacturers in China are selling predominantly to India. And they ship the solar panels all the way from China to India past Sri Lanka. And my dad said, imagine if one of them was located in Sri Lanka and didn't have to incur all those shipping costs. So I think we should go for solar panels. So he said, that's great. First capability that you didn't have yesterday was being able to identify sectors. Have you done a perfect scientific job of this? No. Have you given us some good starting points? Yes. What's the next step? Well, the next step is you need to go look at all of these sectors and you need to understand them. Perfect. So they go away and they start to do their homework. Come back a week later and they have stacks of paper. And the lady who was working on solar panels says, I'm very excited. I've worked out that solar panels require the kind of resources that are available here in Sri Lanka. I've also worked out that there are connections with some of the firms that do the production here in Sri Lanka. Did she know this a week before? No. Is she uncovering some of the things that she says she doesn't know how to do, which is, I don't know where the investors are, I don't know why they would come here, and I don't know how to speak to them? Yes, she's already learning. To cut a long story short, this process of progressively confronting the problem you face, making it as small as possible so you can act into it with the capability you have today, but focusing on building your capabilities gradually as you move through in an iterative approach, stopping every 2 weeks or every week to ask, what did you do? What did you learn? What are you struggling with? And what's next? Led this team within a year to land a new investor for the country. Now, here's the part of it that is most interesting. The consulting firm that I told you about, in the same amount of time and at much greater cost, delivered a report on which sectors they thought the country should invest in. Right? Now, there was no capacity that they were transferring in that process. There was no product that they were delivering. The team that we were working with, because they confronted their problems, solved them gradually, and got to the other side, had more confidence, had more capability, and started asking, what is next? What is next? And Michael, when you ask, what is the greatest progress indicator that you could have when you're thinking about developing a new strategy? The best progress indicator in the development journey is if the people in your country learn how to do something new quickly, and at the end of it say, what is it that is next? Because development is not a one-off discrete process. It is a continuous process, and it requires that we have a hunger and a capability to keep addressing the problems that we face. If you guys manage to solve the education problems that you have in Morocco through whatever you develop in the next few months, you will find that there are more education problems on the other side. If you guys manage to follow some of the address some of the youth unemployment problems in the short run, what you will find is that there will be more problems related to the solution of that on the other side. This is what development is about. And the way in which we keep up with all of the challenges of development is by building capability to do so. So the example of Sri Lanka is one of them. Another example is the country of Albania. And our work has been inspired by Einstein's statement is we don't want to sit with theory, but we're very interested in theory. And we don't want to sit just with practice, but we're very interested in practice. So we try to put the two together. So our research agenda is called an action research agenda, where the work is with real people in real places, trying new things with a very strong theoretical underpinning. And one of the first places where we did this was in Albania in 2013 and 2014. One of the problems that they faced in Albania was that they had a sector that was struggling, and that sector was responsible for many of the jobs, for a lot of the foreign exchange. And the government came to us and said, we can't afford for this sector to go away. We have to be able to rescue this sector. And I remember having a conversation with the Prime Minister and saying, that's great. You know, all we need is a couple of teams, maybe 5 or 6 people in each team. The Prime Minister said, we do not have the capacity to implement the kind of thing that you want to do. We don't have even that many people. And this is what I hear in many countries. And we said, look, give us the people who are meant to do the work, the people who are hired to be part of your government, because they need to build their capability. And if they can't build their capability, we need to know that too. They put a team together. The team was about 5 or 6 people. They started off going to firms and saying in the sector and saying to them, what's wrong? Why can't you grow? Why aren't you exporting more? Why aren't you hiring more? And they came back with a list of 42 problems. And that list of 42 problems then turned into an action agenda. And the action agenda was something that they went through week by week for 7 months. And at the end of 7 months, they were no longer a team of 6 or 7 people. They were a network that connected the whole of government and the private sector together in an effort to rescue the sector. They were at the center of this, but they were connected to the chambers of business. They were connected to the people who were working in areas to do with health and to do with employment creation. They were dealing with sectors that were working on innovation. They were working with the banking sector on subsidies for the sector. And they managed to solve a range of issues for the sector. And then next year it grew by 15%, and it's grown every year since that time. Now, the best part of that story, and I raise it in Albania, is because we've been working there for 5 or 6 years now. Actually, sure, you get older, it's 7 years. And I have the privilege of working with my colleague, Ricardo Hausman. And the country keeps doing well. And the people who have been through this process and who have built their capability have emerged and have moved upwards in society into positions where they now manage corporations, they manage ministries, they manage departments, and they are bringing the new capability to the new challenges as the country grows and develops. The idea again, we don't grow and develop by just implementing discrete projects. We grow and develop by using projects to build capability that helps us to deal with the things that we face today, but also the things that we face in the future. I'm going to finish in a second, but I did tell Michael that I would relate this to one of the other areas that I have a lot of interest in, which is football, soccer. I do a lot of research on soccer, on the business of soccer, on the finances of soccer. And I'm particularly interested in African soccer. And I'm going to conclude with this narrative because I know you are developing a vision statement, you are developing a strategy, and it's important that the strategy gets you where you want to get to. And I don't think that we have that in African football. In 1977, somebody that we may know called Pele made the visionary statement that an African nation would win the World Cup by the year 2000.
Yes.
I think that we have forgotten that visionary statement because it's a little bit embarrassing for people from the continent. And by the way, you guys are from the north, I'm from South Africa, so this is why I'm particularly interested. The interesting thing was that African countries have not been able to do that, not because they lacked the opportunity. So up until that point, only 3 African countries had ever played in the 10 World Cups preceding that date. And they had played 7 games, lost 6 of them, and drawn 1. So it was quite a visionary statement. It was exceptionally optimistic for Pele to say at the time. Since that time, African countries have played 41 times in World Cup tournaments, but they have only progressed past the first round 26% of the time. And the progression rate has declined over time. The first team, by the way, to progress from the first round was Morocco in 1986. Now, we could look at African football and we could say, but they had this vision. They just didn't implement it. And I would say, well, if you think about discretely how different teams have done, they implemented quite well at periods of time. The Moroccan team in 1986, the Cameroonian team in 1990. You have the Ghanaian team in 2010. And they managed to go as far as the second round, as far as the quarterfinals, and then they lost in tragic circumstances, and people will say, well, you know what? You can't blame them for not having luck. What I say is this: luck is where opportunity meets preparation. Let me change that. Luck is where opportunity meets capability. And you have too many African teams that have gigantic talent. But when you look back and you say, what does the system look like from which they come? You find that the administration doesn't work very well. The clubs don't have enough infrastructure. They can't hold on to their talent. The most tragic thing about African football is that 12 players with African descent won the World Cup in 2018 representing France. Now, I don't want to, I know that there are people who are sitting in France right now. I know that there are many of you who are dual French citizens. And I think it is wonderful that players like Moussa Sissoko are playing for France. I think that it is wonderful that players like Steve Mandanda are playing for France. As an African, I would prefer that they were playing for the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think that what you find in a lot of these countries, though, is that they have not built the capability to build their talent, to hold their talent, to build their infrastructure, to hold their infrastructure. And over time, they are depending purely on luck based on opportunity. It's the same in development. It can't just be the opportunity of a new project, the opportunity of a new vaccine, the opportunity of a new vision statement. We need to use those vision statements. We need to use these opportunities to build capability that over time will give us the success that is called development. So that's a long conversation. I've taken 40 minutes of our time. I'm now completely open to questions. Anything that is a response, a clarification from what I was saying, or anything that I didn't address and you'd like to ask me, I'm happy to engage with.
All right, let me come back online, Matt. Thank you very much, first of all. We loved, a number of us loved your football analogy because we're just great football fans. And it is true, there's a lot of African football. It just plays under the wrong colors. And by the way, I'm sitting in France right now.
Yeah.
So we're going to open the discussion now. I just want to see if I captured the gist of what you said with three comments. I'm basically quoting you, but I thought these were the three things which really struck me the most in what was a very interesting expose. Number one, you create policies that deliver capabilities that deliver policies. I love that. This is phenomenal. We've never thought about it this way, and I think this is exactly at the core of change. Number two, you act into the capabilities that you have today, and then you build from there. It's also very important, right? We can be very ambitious, and we are ambitious. We're going to be very ambitious for our country. We are pushed to be ambitious, if I dare say that. But we still need to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And that addresses that point, I think. And the third thing is the importance of connecting people, of working in networks. The example you mentioned about that small European Eastern country was very interesting. And I think that is another thing we all have been working on internally as a commission, connecting and networking with each other. But I think we need to expand that, of course, to the net result and to the way the country moves forward. So, have I heard you correctly? Okay. Are you taking me as your teaching assistant?
I think it sounds fantastic. You did a better job than I do in my own work.
All right, wonderful. So let's get some of our friends. I have to check on the chat to see who wants to talk. I know Leila wanted to speak, but maybe I'll give her a little more time. Let's start with Fouad. Fouad Laoui. Maybe Fouad.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Matt. It was really inspiring, very interesting. I'm not going to talk about football. I'd love to, but it's really not the subject today. My question is very simple one. When you're talking about capability, would you say that there is a set of capabilities which is like universal, which is valid from all countries, or would you tailor make, bespoke a set of capabilities which is okay for a country, but which is different for another country? That's my question.
Let me answer that directly and say, it's a really great question, and we spend a lot of time thinking about this. And I would say it's both at the same time. It's that there are generic and bespoke capabilities at the same time. Countries tend to be in different places, and the things that countries are trying to do are different in different places, and the capabilities that you need are going to be different because contexts are different. So, even if you say, well, we are trying to grow our economy, or we're trying to deal with youth unemployment in Morocco, and I would say, you know what, they're dealing with a similar problem in the Czech Republic, and they're dealing with a similar problem in Honduras, and they're dealing with a similar problem in South Africa. You could say, well, maybe we need the same capabilities and we can learn directly what they're doing. And I'd say you can learn what they're doing, and that'll be useful for you, because every example of people who are going through the same challenge is useful. But their context is different. The politics is different. The things that they're starting with are different. The opportunities that they have are different. So the thing that is going to be generic, or the thing that is going to be overlapping or transversal as a capability, is, do you have the capabilities to identify the problems that you face and to work through those problems? That capability, that set of skills, that set of empowered abilities is something that we see that is quite consistently needed across most countries. The application of those capabilities is often going to be different, and different places are going to use it differently. And what we would say is this kind of problem-solving capability is what we think, and when I say we, I'm talking about the people at my research program, it's what we think essentially defines a country as successful or not. If you have that capability, and it could be in the public sector, it could be in the private sector, it could be in the non-profit sector, and it should be in all of them, you will find that you have the ability to deal with whatever challenges you face. That is the capability that we are trying to develop. So when we work in governments, we are very interested in not so much the limited technical capability of, can these people learn how to work on education? Can these people learn how to work on health? Can these people learn how to work on industrial development? We're interested in, can they learn how to identify a problem, how to mobilize themselves to respond to a problem, how to work gradually into that problem from where they are, and how to solve it. Because if you can build that muscle can be exercised anywhere in the country at any given time. And it is the capability that will help you develop it. And the key point here is that the challenges you face are going to change over time. And it is this capability that sticks and is consistently needed throughout the process. So while the problems will be different, I think there is something generic about learning how to be able to do those things. Now, my sense is that a lot of people you are on this call are probably business people. And my sense is that you probably relate to this. And you say, yeah, if you're an entrepreneur, the thing you need to know how to do is to address problems. Because when you see an opportunity and you try to take it, there are a million things that get in the way. And this capability of being able to not take no for an answer, this capability of not giving up, but really pushing through, is a key capability that we need to develop. Now, I'll use this also to get to one of Michael's questions, which is, how do we measure success? We measure success in our work by actually saying, what does this capability look like, and how do we measure it? And there are a few things we're interested in. We think that this capability materializes or manifests in people being able to talk to each other, because if you talk to each other, you learn about their problems. You also learn about the opportunities to deal with it. It also manifests in people taking risk, right? So we are very interested in how big are the policy networks becoming? What kinds of risks are people in those policy networks taking, and is that growing over time? These are the kind of indicators that we actually calculate and we follow through on to see whether or not countries are building these capabilities.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Leila is back on the line, so to you, Leila.
Thanks, Michael. Good evening, Matt. Do you hear me well?
I do. Nice to be
Excellent.
with you.
Excellent. Matt, I was just surprised, I'm not surprised, but very interested in one of the excellent examples that you gave, one of them being Bahrain, actually. And I was intrigued a little bit by your utilization of that example, and I was curious to know, what do you think are the key success factors that you think, in your opinion, Bahrain has used to implement the methodology, but also where do you see the iteration? I mean, you insisted a lot on the iterative process. Where do you see the iteration in the case of Bahrain? Because I think some of those ideas could be useful for Morocco. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. So, Bahrain is usually quite interesting for people because they often say to me, in the Middle East, surely you're going to say that the successes are the UAE, it's going to be Dubai, etc. I think Bahrain is much more interesting for me because they had less oil money sooner. So they needed to iterate and they needed to find different ways to do things. And the country is more diversified than most Middle Eastern countries. They moved into banking earlier on. They moved into logistics in a specific way earlier on. And if you look at the health sector, if you look at the education sector and a range of other sectors in Bahrain, they have shown themselves to be quite resilient given where they are and given their natural resource allocations and the challenges that they face. What I see is that it's a country that is proud, looks to be independent, and certainly from an economic perspective and from a public service delivery perspective has constantly over the last 20 or 30 years looked for new horizons. It has not sat still. It has constantly said, if we want to develop, we don't find ourselves in one place and stop there. We essentially push our way into a new place. Looking closely at the government in Bahrain, you would see that there is an emphasis on constantly identifying new opportunities and the problems that they address and working through those problems towards new ideas. I've been spending quite a lot of time focusing on their response to COVID, for instance, and in that response to COVID, you get to see some of this DNA coming through. The country responded very early to COVID. They were extremely dynamic in the early response, and while they certainly have had their share of heartache and difficulty, I think that it's one of the countries that you're going to see a lot of innovation coming from because they were nimble in their response. So it's a much longer response that I can give you. We have a couple of blog posts on Bahrain that are interesting. One of the things that I have been involved with in Bahrain is that when they found out that we had this methodology called PDIA that essentially put together a lot of the methodologies that they had used over a period of time to be dynamic, but they had never been able to nominate or package, they got hold of us and they said, come and help us. They have a very interesting program in the government where they choose people from across the government to go through a 1-year program where they work directly at the center of government on the country's biggest problems. So they'll take people from the Ministry of Health, from the Ministry of Education, they'll take people working on water, they'll take people working on electricity, they'll take people working on industrial development, and they'll put them together in the same place for a year. And they'll go through a process where they learn about leadership development. They learn about managing upwards. They learn about being nimble. They learn about a variety of factors. And they do this together. At the end of that period, they send them back to their ministries. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to develop a cadre of people across government, not in one place, and some of them go into the private sector, that forms a network or a system of capability. People who think the same way, people who have that same kind of nimble attitude towards life, etc. They've been working on this now for, if I'm correct, about 5 or 6 years. They have hundreds of people who are across their government. And I don't want to use a metaphor that is really out of place right now. But in essence, it's like a positive virus of capability that goes through the system. We see this as a very interesting way of building capability across your society. We saw it also as a way in which Costa Rica built its capability in the late 1990s. They developed a mechanism called CSMD, and CSMD was essentially the arm of the government that reached out to attract foreign investment. But they said, when you attract foreign investment, the investors are going to ask questions about education. They're going to ask about land. They're going to ask about healthcare. They're going to ask about all sorts of things. So we need to be able to get all of those answers. And you can't get them in one place. They're going to be throughout the whole of government. So CSMD essentially allowed people to move in and out from all of these different areas, and they would work together. They would learn the same ways of being responsive to the private sector, and then they would go back. So then when a company came and they said to someone in CSMD, we need something in education, the people would say, let me call our friend in education. And this is one of the strategies that you have in Bahrain, is they try to build a way of thinking that goes across the whole of government and creates the systemic capability through the connections that are fostered. It's a very interesting, very creative way of thinking about building capability.
Thank you, Matt. Next question from Mustafa Terab, a great friend of Harvard. Mustafa, yours. Hello? All right.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you fine. Go on.
Great. I was thanking you, Mikhail, for allowing us to have this great presentation. Thank you also, Professor Andrews. My question is, I'm curious about, in terms of your own experience, the necessity to build what I would call a meta capability, which is a capability that a civil servant will have to accept the proposition that they will have to evolve and improve their own capability and that change management, with the paradox that you probably have encountered, that the most highly trained civil servants are usually those who are likely not to accept the proposition that this whole thing is a learning experience. It goes to their ontological security, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mustafa, great question. One of the, I would say, I would characterize it, and hopefully it's okay, as saying, how do you motivate people who don't think this way to think this way? Or how do you motivate people who don't think this way to realize that they need to learn how to think this way, right? The great, I see in the chat that I got the years of the Morocco team and other teams incorrect. So some of my facts are wrong sometimes, but one other pop culture references to a song by the Grateful Dead, and the Grateful Dead had a great lyric where they said, you ain't going to learn what you don't want to know. And I think that one of the challenges that we face in many governments is that these governments have been unsuccessful for long periods of time. And they have created lots of excuses about this. And they have also created structures that allow them to feel good about themselves, even though they don't pull these things off and they don't serve their people well. I don't want to characterize this as any specific country. I have not worked in Morocco, so I don't know the system well enough. But many of the countries that I work on look like this. My colleague, Ronnie Heifetz, he speaks about work avoidance. And he says in many bureaucracies, people haven't performed for long periods of time, and they develop a lot of systems and mechanisms that allow them to avoid the hard work of becoming successful. And he characterizes it as saying, they develop strategies that help them sleep well at night, even though they possibly shouldn't sleep well at night because they're underperforming. And Mustafa, we go into governments where where there are people who have been stuck in this kind of structure for a long time. And you're right, there's something ontological about it. There's something extremely deep about it. Here's what I also find. The literature on public servants tells us that many people get into public service because they want to serve the public. And that what happens over their careers is that they become overwhelmed by bureaucracy. And they become overwhelmed by the fact that they can never really make a difference. And so within that literature, there is this kind of nugget of thought that if you can reawaken the motivation that brought people into public service in the first place, maybe you can get them to do more than they're doing today. And this is one of the things that we theoretically have been toying with for the last decade in the PDIA work. And we go into governments and we use some tools to mobilize people. And one of the basic tools is to sit with everybody who's going to be in a part of the team and to say, how much do you care about this problem? How much are you willing to address this problem? How much are you willing to learn new things, even though you may not want to learn those new things because you feel very comfortable where you are? Now, we are not always successful in being able to bring people into the teams that do this learning. We are not always successful in being able to hold people in the teams. But here's what I would say. In all of the teams where we have worked, I would say that we have a 60 to 70% success rate, meaning that the teams hold together, they build capabilities, and they make significant progress in solving the problems that they're trying to solve. And 60 to 70% is extraordinarily high by any metric anywhere. And the reason why I think this is the case is that the people who you are speaking about care more than we let them reflect it in their day-to-day jobs. They have more capability than we let them exercise in their day-to-day jobs. And when you create a new vehicle, a new mechanism, a new holding environment or space in which they can act with more creativity, with more freedom, with more flexibility, and with more responsibility, we find that many of them take it. They grab hold of it and they run. Now, we do not work with them permanently in this new space because it's too much for them to deal with, given this other part of them that is saying, but I know my job is secure, I don't want all of the risk of doing kind of risky things. So we only have them work in this space 1 day a week. The other 4 days a week, they go back to their day job and they work in government. But we find that most of them, when they come into that 1 day a week where they're doing this exciting work that they care about, solving problems that they are motivated by, we find that they outperform expectations. And I would assume, given our experience in other countries, that it is the same in Morocco. That capability is not just about the ability of the individual. It's about the way in which the ability of the individual has been empowered or disempowered by the organizations that they are in. And we find that the authorizing mechanisms that squash people and the failure to motivate and mobilize people from the inside is primarily the thing that leads to low capability. It's not the individual themselves. So part of this process is about engaging with the individuals, organizing them in different ways, giving them more responsibility, giving them more purpose. And we find that that actually is quite effective in getting them into this new space.
Hey, Matt, I see from the chat that your last point is getting a lot of resonance with my colleagues. I also noticed did you say you don't know Morocco? I think we're going to have to fix this, okay? And hopefully get you to the success rate which you've been experiencing elsewhere, also in our country. So we have 4 or 5 more colleagues who would like to ask a question. Next is my friend Ahmed Shami.
Thanks, Michael. Hey, Matt, thanks a lot for a very enlightening discussion and presentation. And if you allow me, I would like to make a few comments, and I have a question for you. The first comment is you know, this, what you just explained, the PDIA methodology, I think it will really fit perfectly in the second section of our report, the report that we have been mandated for. This second is, we call it methodology for change. Mm-hmm. Basically, I think this is really the right fit to, and I have to confess that before talking to you, we didn't have this kind of approach in mind. Better late than never, and we still have some time, I think, to integrate it. And Mustafa Turab is really leading that piece of the work. So I'm sure that he's going to be interested in what you just presented. Second comment, you know, I had the chance to work for 11 years for Microsoft, and basically what you described is really what big corporations stand for. You know, we had this saying, going back to the drawing board. And in fact, it's exactly what you explained. But it's done in a corporation where all people are aligned, where you have motivation systems, reward systems. It's much easier, I think, to have this type of methodology in this environment than in, you know, public or in a government. So that's and I don't know if you have been inspired, you know, when you were working on this, on defining this PDIA approach by what was happening in large corporations. And I have this strong feeling that at one point in time, government should learn from these big corporations and become as effective as they are. And I think that's one of the way they can become with what you presented. Now let's move on to the question. Basically, Mustafa just asked the question before, the civil servants. But before the civil servants, there is the political leaders. So political leaders, I mean, the Prime Minister of Albania called on you to make this happen. I'm not sure that every political leader in this type of positions would be open, you know, to learning from you or from other countries, you know, the things that work. So that's the first impediment. The second thing, once you get that buy-in, then you go to the civil servants level. And I think that you just explained nicely, and you responded to Mustafa Turab on how you get them on board. But then, even when you get them on board, you know, and you go through this iterative process and of defining the project, building capabilities through project, that's great. But you know that at the end of the day, you will have to execute on the project, correct? I mean, because it's not just the whole process. So executing on the project is not just about the buy-in. There are specific skills and there are externalities. And this is where my question is. How do you deal with externalities like corruption, like informality? You have to understand that in Morocco, more than 50%, you know, of the businesses are informal. Yeah. So how do you deal with bureaucracy? So how do you deal in your approach with those very negative externalities? Thank you.
Well, you know, it's my colleague Ricardo Hausman says, you know, why make something difficult when you can make it impossible, right? And sometimes when you think about doing public policy, it's like that. It's you know, there's so many externalities, and the systems have been so shaped that they don't deal with those things very well. Let me say yes. Firstly, very inspired by the private sector. I think the idea that you said in the private sector, sometimes the incentive paradigms in that are more aligned, so it makes it easier to work in this way, and I think that is true. So one of the things we're trying to do is say, not how do you make the public sector the private sector, because I don't believe that that's what we're trying to do here. I believe that you need a public sector and the private sector, or else I wouldn't be teaching at the Kennedy School. But how do we think about creating some of these motivational mechanisms and things in the public sector? And I think it's possible. You know, the question about working with projects, I don't want you to hear me saying that projects don't matter and that the goal isn't to deliver. What we say is the goal is to build capability through the project. So the project doesn't become the deliverable, the project becomes the vehicle. right? And so we're not saying that we don't want delivery. We are saying that we want delivery, but we want you at the end of the delivery to say we can deliver more. We know how to do that, and we can do the next thing, right? That's the thing that's important here. Now, just say because we're doing PDIA and because we're from Harvard doesn't mean that the externalities go away. It doesn't mean that corruption goes away. It doesn't mean that bureaucratic infighting goes away. All of those things that get in the way, they're always there. When we are working with the teams, one of the capabilities that we're trying to build in the teams is the capability to deal with those externalities. And I think, one of the questions that Michael asked at the bottom was about blockages. How do you deal with blockages? And these are blockages, right? You start with a project and then you find down the line that the Ministry of Finance won't release the money. Or you start with the project and you find that people in the project team are corrupt. Or you start with the project and you find that certain parts of society don't support the project, and now they're out and they don't want you to do this, right? These are things that happen with public policy. They happen because you're dealing with public money, so therefore corruption is more common than in the private sector, just by definition. You're dealing with diverse groups because it's public policy, so therefore they're going to be more unhappy people. You're dealing with people who hopefully have the right to tell you that they don't like what you're doing, so they're going to, right? So these things happen a lot. Now, one of the things that we do through the project is we stop regularly and we don't just ask people, what are you learning technically? We ask them, what are you learning about these things? And oftentimes the things that they'll learn is they'll say, well, we started working really well, and we haven't been able to get a meeting with the minister for the last month. The minister's suddenly just gone quiet on us. Well, why has the minister gone quiet on you? I don't know. I don't think he likes what we're doing. I think this isn't something that, he knew was going to happen. Or maybe his interest is being threatened or whatever it is. And then we say, okay, how do you get past that blockage? We have certainly been in places where we've worked on health, we've worked on electricity, we've worked on roads, we've worked on all of these areas. I nominate them because corruption happens in them, right? And we've worked on projects where the team has come to us and they've said, we've hit a roadblock. And we say to them, what's the roadblock? And they start to say, well, it's this. And we say, no, you're not telling us what it is. And they say, no, we have a corruption problem in our midst, in our team, right? And then we say, okay, how often does this happen? They say, well, it always happens, right? We always have these interests that come up. We say, what usually happens when this happens? And they say, well, usually the project stops because we don't know how to deal with this. And then we say to them, well, the project can't stop. So let's treat this as the problem and let's think about how we deal with this problem. Let's break it down and let's deal with it itself. The capability to deal with these externalities is as important as any other capability in public organizations. Remember, I used the word earlier from my colleague Ron Harpert, work avoidance. The number one work avoidance is with these things. People run into these things and they say, I don't want to deal with them. They're too scary. They're too risky. They're too difficult. So we have a bunch of things that we help people deal with some of these issues. One, you're part of a team and the team will help you do a risky thing that you couldn't do by yourself before, right? You're part of a process that takes small steps rather than big steps. So every small step you take allows you to manage the risk of dealing with a corrupt individual or whatever that may be, right? So you're part of a team, you're taking small steps. The third thing is that we can pivot and we can adapt. And often in projects, instead of giving up, you say, do we need to pivot? Do we need to adapt? Do we need to try something else? And because we're giving people that safe space where they can do that, it gives them a lot more tools to deal with these externalities. So I want to affirm what you're saying. These roadblocks, these externalities, they happen all the time. A methodology that doesn't deal with them is not a methodology worth engaging with. And it's probably my number one frustration with a lot of the capacity building methodologies that exist in the development community. Because I don't see those methodologies training people. How do you get past these things that happen? They're unsavory. We don't want to talk about them. They're difficult. Well, you have to. This is the only way that you get things done. So part of the learning process in PDIA is learning to identify these things, learning to go through them, go around them, pivot past them, whatever that may be. And that's what this process allows you to do.
Thanks a lot. Fair enough. I love your South African accent, by the way.
Thank you.
We're really at the heart of implementation here, Matt. You should tell him you love his Moroccan accent.
I love all of the accents I hear.
all of the African accents. We're all part of the same great continent. We have 3 more questions and about 17 minutes left. So next one is Mohammed Ben Musa.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Professor Matt, for your very interesting presentation. I captured a main idea that building capabilities is more important than building projects and delivery projects. And projects must be the best way to construct and to build capabilities. 2 questions about that. The first one is, who is able to make an assessment or to evaluate capabilities of people, particularly the decision makers in the administration, and how to reinforce and build capabilities of people and capabilities of citizens to make an assessment of capability of political decision makers. My second question is about the culture in public regulation. This way of doing things requires to change the culture in public regulation and to accept the right to make fails, to make mistakes, to fail 1 time, 2 times, many times, in order to be successful after. So how to change this culture, and what are the way to make that mistakes cannot be more serious than mistakes? And perhaps last a question, because I'm an economist and I want to be practical. How can we build capabilities in order to solve our main economic constraints, main economic problems, difficulties in our country? For example, in order to solve the problem of tax evasion, or the problem of public debts, or the problem of financing corporate through the stock market. Thank you so much, Professor Matt.
Mohammed, thank you for those great questions. And let me try and give some answers. I'm not going to be able to answer properly because they really are very, very serious questions. The first thing I would say is that you can look at the capabilities that individuals have, and we are thinking quite seriously about kind of how you would think about that. It depends on where you are in a system. We're interested in a lot of technical people. We're interested in their capabilities to identify problems, their capabilities to break problems down. How capable are they to interact with citizens? What kind of relational connections do they have? If you want to think about potentially the kind of individual assessment you would do, you would be asking a lot less about people's IQ and a lot more about their EQ and their MQ, right? And if you don't know those, then don't worry about that. But you're essentially asking, are they relational? Can they manage? Can they engage with tough problems? And there are, within the literature, there are established ways of asking those questions. Similarly, there are established ways of asking about the capability of people who provide leadership in those systems. And now you're talking about politicians and you're talking about senior civil servants. And part of this is going to be, what kind of environments do they create for the people who work for them? Do they create environments that are safe environments? Do they, and I don't mean physically safe, I mean kind of intellectually, mentally, operationally safe, where people can fail? Do they create environments where people feel effectively delegated to, or do they control too much? There are mechanisms that we can use, again, from the private sector that we can deploy to ask some of these questions. Now, we don't typically, when we work in places, use these mechanisms to evaluate people. We use them more to guide people in the kinds of skills that they need to develop to move into this way. And it's partly because many governments haven't thought like this in the past. This isn't how they've established themselves. And starting to evaluate people based on a new way of thinking, I think, is premature. I think what you need to do is start bringing in new ways of thinking about what is a good minister? What does the job of the minister look like? What is a good director general? What does the job of an effective director general look like? And to start to socialize those mechanisms and those understandings is very, very important. And that's where we would begin. I wouldn't begin by saying, let's put those metrics in the hand of civil society and let them start to assess ministers. The change needs to come from within the system itself. But I can imagine we could have a conversation about that. In terms of assessing capabilities, though, I want to say that the question is less, in my mind, about the capabilities of individuals and more about the capabilities of systems. And here I build on the work of my colleague Ricardo Hausmann, who has done a lot of work on the product space of countries and looking at the complexity of economies. And he is the one who uses a lot this term capabilities, and he essentially says countries become complex in what they do by building their capabilities. And then if you said to Ricardo, what is a capability, he would, and how do you measure it? He would say it is measured in the demonstration of what they do, right? And so I would say, if you were to ask me, even with governments, how do we assess whether they are becoming more capable? You would ask, can they do more things, right? And can they do the things that we care about? So think about education. Many governments have developed the capability to enroll kids in school. They still haven't developed the capability to ensure that kids are learning. Well, I don't want to just send them on a training program and tick some boxes to say they've learned how to do a new syllabus or they've learned how to do teacher training. The capability is, have you learned how to do this thing that we don't know how to do yet? And that is going to be about bringing people together and creating lucky moments and facilitating the emergence of learning in ways that we haven't seen. So the true measure of capability is the demonstrated ability to do things. And that's what we need to be focusing on. And over time, if you guys are developing your strategy, that's the kind of language that I would encourage you to think about, right? It's not about ticking boxes. It's about essentially saying, are we getting where we need to get to? Now, this is a much more risky way of developing a vision, because as soon as you put out and you say, we really want to get there, we really want to get to that destination, you raise the question, well, what happens if we fail? What if we don't get there? And I think that we need to have that amount of failure. We need to have that appetite, and we need to say, we have to get there. Failing is not an option. And to, you know, I've never found a government where I can say, fail, you know, in the private sector, you can say there's a whole lot of things. Fail forward, fail quickly, etc. I've never, ever heard any politician that likes the word failure. I've tried to bring that language in. Here is a word that they do like. They like the word progress. And tied to the word progress, they like the word learn. And one of the things that we find is really important is that you need to find what we call an authorizer with an itch. An authorizer with an itch. It could be a monarch. It could be a prime minister. It could be a minister. Someone who is saying, we've been doing it one way for a long time and it doesn't work. We need to try something else. And when they are open to try something else, you say to them, the something else is something that requires learning, because it hasn't worked, but we don't know why. So the only way that we invade things we don't know today is by learning. And you speak to them about the flip side of failure, which is learning. And I think people in the private sector understand this. Why do we say embrace failure? Because we understand that we learn more when we fail than when we succeed. In the public sector, I don't speak about failure, I speak about learning. The last thing you asked about is, how do you use this approach to build the capabilities to deal with economic issues? This has been the number one area where I've worked, because most of my work has been with Ricardo Hausmann. And most of it has been working with governments who are saying, how do we grow? And that could be, how do we grow through new industrial policy? It could be, how do we deregulate? It could be, how do we establish industrial zones? Whatever it may be, we have worked on all of those projects. And I would say you do it through this process. You do it through this process where you say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How do we invade that problem? How do we bring teams together to solve that problem? And how do we put them into this iterative process where they find the solution and build their capability at the same time, step by step, gradually? And I think it's actually very well suited to dealing with economic problems.
Thank you so much, Professor Matt, for your answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for great questions and for all you do.
Thank you, Smed. Now a question from the youngest member of the commission. He's young enough to be your student, Matt, but he's wise enough to be teaching all of us. Khalid, yours.
Too kind, Michael. Thank you very much. Hi, Matt. Thank you for the awesome presentation and the answers to many of my questions that I had. Doesn't leave me much to ask anymore, but I will say this. I've been fortunate enough, and as you said, luck is, when opportunity meets preparation, to be able to do some work as an invited expert on G20 board and to work with the Economic Forum on some international policy. When obviously you've gone through this with other countries you've worked with, how do we and give more credit to young voices within policy making? I know it's a quite complex question, but I want your on-the-spot thought on this. How do we enable young people that have things to say and that have, a fresh and specific on how things should be in their countries? How do we enable them to access the public policy platforms, especially with the PDIA methodology, where they're, as Mr. Mustafa says, it enables the creative and collaborative process. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. I didn't share everything, but I think I got the gist of it. And I think the gist of it is, how do we bring young voices into this process? And here's the where we do this a lot. You notice it's called problem-driven iterative adaptation. The first step is bringing people together to say, what is the problem? And I think one of the problems that we've had, one of the difficulties, one of the limits, one of the failures of public policy in the past is that we have too few people involved in setting the agenda, and those people are not representative of the future, meaning that we very seldom allow the youth, young voices, into the conversation about the policy agenda that we are involved in now, when in fact the policy agenda that we're involved in now is the thing that creates the future. And so the question is, how do we involve young people? And I would say, how do we involve all other groups that we are concerned about, whether that is women, whether that is people of color, whether that is other minorities, whoever that is? How do we involve them more in that first stage, which is identifying the problem and then working together to solve the problem? So where we have worked on issues that pertain to this before, we have worked very hard to ensure that those initiating teams are not just initiating teams of established public servants. They also involve people from civil society. They also involve people representing young people, etc. And they get together and they say, what is the problem from our perspective? And so then you have a team that creates a new version of the problem and a new vision of the problem. And they then start to say, okay, let's break the problem down and let's start to move together to solve it. So part of it is about including young people in the process, not once you've decided what the process looks like, but at the beginning and all the way along, so that they get to define what the agenda looks like, they get to define the details of the agenda, and they get to provide ownership in implementing the solutions as it moves along. It's very easy to integrate them into the PDIA process. I would say, for instance, if you were saying the PDIA process sounds interesting, one of the big challenges in Morocco is youth unemployment, I would say, hey, let's get 3 or 4 teams together. Let's make sure that those teams blend together people who are older in business and who know a little bit about kind of what it's like to run a business in Morocco. Let's get people from the public sector who run the regulatory regimes that we have problems with. Let's get people now from the private sector, from the young community who maybe are unemployed. Let's bring all of those people together and let's try and blend their experience and put them in a process where they define the problem, they break the problem down, and they work together to solve it. because bringing people together in that way is the best way in which you can get all views of the problem and where you can mobilize all of the capabilities that you're going to need to solve that problem.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you.
All right, so I get to ask the last question. Actually, I have two questions for you. One on behalf of one of our, again, youngest and brightest members who had to leave, Khadija, but she asked me to ask the question. And then I have a final question for you based on, again, the resonance of something you said in the chat. If I could just get back to it. Here we go. So Khadija's question is the following. How can we measure Moroccan capabilities to implement a strategy or a project, especially in the public policy field? Are there any specific parameters to take into account? And then I'll ask the last question, which is the one which resonated so much. What does it take to create safe spaces in an administration that still reflects, to some extent, a history or structure driven by authority?
Okay, again, really hard questions. Yeah, it's fine. You know, these are questions we deal with all the time. And my first answer: how do we measure the capability that exists? As I said earlier, I'm very interested in demonstrated capabilities. So, you know, in preparation for this, I've spent a lot of time looking at indicators. I'm a lot less interested in the indicators of organizations that ask about perceptions of, you know, how efficient are government officials. I'm much more interested in indicators that tell us how long it takes for something to get done. I'm much more interested in indicators that tell us about how effective has government been in providing electricity, right? So I will spend my time looking at demonstrated capability, where society has had problems. Have we seen that government has been able to invade those problems or not? And the interesting thing in every country is that you find that there is an average, and then there are deviants. There's some sectors where the capabilities are lower, and then there are what we call positive deviants, where actually you see that people are able to achieve more things. And one of the things we would do is we would then want to have a look at the negative deviants, the positive deviants, and we try to understand what is the inertial pull to the center, but very particularly, what is it that allows some areas to be positive deviance, and how do we then start to replicate that? So we would look at that kind of data to get a sense of things. I would also say this, though. I'm not focused when people say, is existing capability a prerequisite to doing PDIA? No, PDIA is the thing that you use to build capability. So, you know, I'm not really that interested in kind of knowing what the capability is up front. I'm more interested in you sending the people who have been hired to do the job, because they actually get that paycheck and that's what they're told to do. And what we would do is we would work with them and say, you need to do that. That's what you have to do. Then the question is, how do you create the safe space for them to work? And this is hard, right? And what I said earlier is, you know, when we start, we're very interested, firstly, in finding the authorizer with an itch. Because if you find the authorizer with an itch who says, things haven't worked in the way before, I'm willing to try something new, then we say to them, this is where we're going to go to. And we rely on authorizers to create those safe spaces, right? And in governments, this is very important, because governments are bureaucracies. And in bureaucracies, the spaces that are created by the people who are at the top. And those people are the ones who can create these safe spaces. We're not looking for gigantic spaces. And this is one of the key things, is sometimes you just look for a small space. You look for an authorizer who will give you a small space. Now, sometimes that person isn't the king. Sometimes that person isn't the prime minister. Sometimes that person's the director general. And that person is kind of in the bureaucracy and will say, I'm going to cultivate this really small space. And we say, that's great, you'll work there. What we try to do then is we try to grow the space, right? And that's what you're trying to do. You're not trying to kind of say, well, you're not allowing yourself to be limited from the space that is there. You try to grow the space. And you grow the space by essentially building legitimacy and building functionality gradually over time, building the confidence of the people in the space, building the network, bringing other authorizers into it. So the strategy of PDIA, because it's iterative, is you start where you can. And I would argue that there are always going to be authorizers with an itch. There are always going to be people who will say, I'll take a risk on this. When they say we're going to take a risk on this, we don't then say to them, we'll see you in 5 years. We say to them, we're going to be very aware of respecting the fact that you've given us this space. And we're going to come back to you every week, every 2 weeks. And we're going to say to you, how's it going? How's the heat in the kitchen? Is this too risky? Are they doing things in there that you're uncomfortable with? And we're gonna help those authorizers understand what it is like to be the authorizer of a safe space, because they've never been there before. But the iteration is what allows you to give and take and to move back and forward between the worker bees in the space and the authorizers of the space. One of the great things that usually comes out of this is that authorizers learn to trust their people more, and the people learn what it's like to be trusted more. And I think that everybody who is on this call probably knows that organizations are at their most effective when authorizers know how to trust their people and people feel trusted. And this is, I think, what you're trying to cultivate, because when that starts to happen, you start to see success. And when you start to see success, you start to get other people in the system saying, what's going on over there? I want some of it. And this is when you start to create that kind of infection that spreads. It's not easy, and I don't want anything that I have suggested to sound like it is easy. It is exceptionally hard. It is very hard, but it is possible, and I believe that this is the way in which we do capability building for development.
Thank you, Matt. I think that that closes, and we're within a few minutes of our scheduled time. Thank you so much for doing this with us. I think you've made yourself a lot of new friends today, and we certainly look forward to seeing you in Morocco and hopefully work in Morocco. I also want to thank all the participants for their involvement and questions. And finally, last but not least, I want to thank Hind Kadiri, who gets all the credit for the idea of getting you in front of us and also for implementing it, the key word of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Mikhail,
Thank you, everybody.
Matt, just one thing. What is your projection? When are we going to win the World Cup in football, Matt?
Yes.
You know, if you want to get me into that, you know, I think right now what I would say is when you're talking about capabilities, one of the problems with African football is we don't pay any attention to administration, etc. Okay. So I would have to say probably never. Unfortunately, probably never is my honest answer to that question. But if anyone from Africa is going to do it, it's probably going to be Morocco.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matt.